Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to St. Martin in the Fields for the next in our series of autumn lectures, Here I Stand. When the veteran Labour MP Tony Benn left Parliament in 2001, he said, "I'm leaving the House of Commons in order to go back into politics." Something similar could perhaps be said of our speaker tonight, although he was more ejected from the House of Commons. But if we think about the theme of our lectures, Here I Stand, Rory Stewart is without question somebody who has taken a stand about Afghanistan, taken a stand about Iraq, taken a stand about prisons, taken a stand about the backstop, taken a stand about the proroguing of Parliament, taken a stand for democracy. And he has also paid the price for the stands he has taken. And yet, I think it is fair to say that through his podcast with his fellow podcaster, whose name escapes me right now, I think it's fair to say that as much as any individual in this country, he has raised the standard of public discourse over the last couple of years and how much we have needed it. And because we admire the way he has stood and taken the consequences and the way he has raised that standard of public discourse, that we have invited him here tonight. Reading his book, Politics on the Edge, is a bit like reading a Dickens novel like Great Expectations or David Copperfield. It's the story of an ordinary person surrounded by a gallery of grotesques. But Rory Stewart is no ordinary person. He is a person who has taken a stand. And because of the way he has taken a stand, we felt we would love to have him as part of this series, and we're honoured that he said yes. Please join me in welcoming Rory Stewart.
Thank you all very, very much indeed for coming. I hope you can hear me clearly at the back. Very good. If you cease to hear me, please sort of wave at me or make some sort of noise of some sort to indicate. I'm also aware that I'm projecting into two different things, so if the sound goes odd, tell me. This is a very, very great honor to be here. I would say, though, there is almost nothing more revolting in the world than a politician pretending to talk about morality. Perhaps only one more revolting thing, which is a politician claiming to talk about morality in a church. I think it is very, very important to understand, notwithstanding the very generous introduction, that politics is at best a very, very murky profession. And it is a profession caught up in a whole series of problems. Problems about the relationship between means and ends, problems about what kind of compromises to make, problems about the impact of politics on your own character, problems about psychology. I mean, who after all wants to be a politician? What kind of hero complexes? What kind of narcissism? What kind of archetypes are taking place when someone stands to be a politician? And for all these reasons, you should be very, very suspicious of politicians standing in a church and talking about morality. I wanted, though, to organize my remarks today around the theme of Aristotle. Because I think Aristotle is a very good way at getting at what morality in politics might be. And I want to compare Aristotle to the person that I see as the great villain in politics, the Italian political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli is somebody who has had an extraordinary 500-year career. You can barely get on the tube without seeing aspiring young business people reading Machiavelli's The Prince. And indeed, there has been a great tendency in recent political theory, for those of you that read Cambridge political theorists, to try to rehabilitate Machiavelli, to present Machiavelli as a great champion of Republican liberty, to try to talk about Machiavelli as our best guide to politics. And very distinguished people. Max Weber, the great sociologist at the beginning of the 20th century, the American philosopher Michael Walzer, all these people have embraced Machiavelli as a guide to politics. But it's a very, very, very dangerous guide to politics. In essence, to sort of spoil the conclusion of my piece, because with Machiavelli, there is no point at which Machiavelli says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." There is, for Machiavelli, no standing. Machiavelli is in perpetual movement. In fact, his book, The Prince, if you read it, is full of different Italian words for movement, for lurching around. Because for him, politics is by its nature an inconstant business. The politician is navigating across a stormy sea, the ocean changing, the winds changing. And the only way in which the politician can survive, Machiavelli answers, is to flip and turn with things as they move. And why? Because for Machiavelli, politics is not anything to do with private moral life. For Machiavelli, as for Weber, and to some extent for Michael Walzer, politics is a world apart. In this particular vision, the public life has nothing to do with the private life, and the standards of the private life cannot be applied to the public life. Because politics is, for Machiavelli, above all, about putting the end in front of the means. Anything is justified in Machiavelli, provided you take power. In the end, all the Prince boils down to is glory and fame, success. And along the way, he describes various heroes of his, Caesar Borgia, for example, being one of them, doing the most unspeakable things in order to take power. And Machiavelli's argument is essentially an argument against Aristotle and against his successor, Cicero. If you read The Prince carefully, what he's really doing is taking on the assumptions of the classical theorists. The classical theorists believe that politics is about virtue. I believe that politics is about honesty, about justice, about mercy, about generosity. And if you look at the chapter headings in The Prince, essentially what Machiavelli is doing is saying politics is not about honesty, it's not about mercy, it's not about generosity. Politics is about power, taking power. And he proceeds to explain why he thinks this should be the case. So, politics for Machiavelli can't really be about honesty, shouldn't really be about honesty, for a number of reasons. One of them is that the public never really know what's going on in 10 Downing Street, or going on in the White House, or going on in the Prince's Palace, going on in Westminster. All they see is what the prince, or the politician in this case, chooses to share. In our modern world, chooses to share, as it were, through the media. All they get is the message which is projected to them. They can never judge actually what is going on. They can't really see how good a minister is or how bad a minister is because they're not sitting in the ministerial office. What they see, Machiavelli says, is what the politician chooses to reveal. Furthermore, he says, because the public is inconstant and lurching around and subject to change, the politician or the prince who serves the public must also be inconstant, lurching around and subject to change. This is because, for Machiavelli, as for many contemporary politicians, the nature of the sea in which the politician swims is an unstable series of popping coalitions. You're playing whack-a-mole with different views popping up from every direction, ever more so, in fact, in a world of social media. And therefore, in order to succeed, the politician needs to be incredibly nimble. If, for example, you were trying to become leader of the Conservative Party in 2019, right, you might conclude, if you'd read Machiavelli well, that you might need to make a whole series of promises to the DUP, the Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party, in order to destroy the soft Brexit deal that Theresa May, the sitting Prime Minister, is trying to get through. Make promises to them saying, there's never going to be a border in the Irish Sea, border over my dead body, destroy Theresa May deal, vote with me, and I'll be able to deliver for you a Northern Ireland with no border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But once you have managed to get the DUP on your side and you have destroyed Theresa May, then you conclude you have to betray the DUP in order to get a deal out of the European Union. So now you go to the European Union and you say, I need to get my oven-ready Brexit deal through as soon as possible. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a border in the Irish Sea, right? And then as soon as you've delivered that deal, then you lurch around 180 degrees again. And you think, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break international law and abrogate the agreement that I've just made with the European Union on the border in the Irish Sea in order to try to placate the DUP again. In doing so, you would be absolutely behaving in the way that Machiavelli believes that you should behave. And indeed, the individual who behaved like that was rewarded, as Machiavelli suggested he would be, with power, provided he takes on board Machiavelli's great claim. Machiavelli's line is, the prince never keeps his word, nor should he. Right? That's the point about honesty. So Aristotle, Cicero is setting up the idea of honesty. Machiavelli is saying no to honesty. I'm not going to continue to develop this, but he does the same with the idea of generosity. Generosity was a very important classical virtue. Rulers were meant to be very generous. Machiavelli says absolute nonsense. Good princes should be stingy. Right? Again, in the classical world, rulers were supposed to be merciful. Aristotle pushes for mercy. Cicero pushes for mercy. These are great virtues for them. But again, Machiavelli says, no, a good ruler should not be merciful. A good ruler should be cruel. You should intimidate. You should impose fear. Now, where does that leave us? Well, I want to suggest a couple of things. I want to suggest, firstly, that we can push back against Aristotle on his understanding of politics. Push back on Machiavelli through Aristotle on the understanding of politics. And we can secondly use Aristotle as a way to look at the shape of the modern world. Right? These are two quite complicated things I'm doing, so I apologize. But let me just take it back to the beginning there. Fundamental, basic fact, Machiavelli argues the way to get to the top is to care only about success and not care about what you have to do to get there. Machiavelli is about inconstancy, changing all the time. Now, what is the response, the first response that Cicero or Aristotle would make to Machiavelli? And we know what that response is because, in fact, Machiavelli was writing in the early 1500s at a time where there was an incredible explosion of Renaissance political thought, which we think about much less today. And Renaissance political thought was not actually heading in Machiavelli's direction. Machiavelli seems to have won the race, because I'm not going to get many friends in this audience if I talk to you about George of Trebizond or Patrizzi, but at the time these were big figures, right? And these were big figures who genuinely believed, like Cicero and Aristotle, that politics was about virtue. The center of their concept is a line from Cicero where he says, the politician exists not just for himself, but for his family and for his country. A fundamental idea that in the end there is an altruistic dimension to the political profession. And three major disagreements with Machiavelli. Number one, they would say that the idea that you can achieve fame and glory by behaving in the kind of way that Boris Johnson behaves, right, is not actually correct. That the kind of fame and glory that you would achieve by behaving in that way is actually a disgusting form of fame and a shameful form of glory. That we do not simply evaluate politicians on the question of whether or not they made it to the top. It is not sufficient in 2016 for Donald Trump to become president of the United States for us then to say, this is a man of fame and glory, he succeeded. No. For the Renaissance political theorists, like the classical political theorists, they would say no, because this man lacks virtue. And it's not a decent form of fame or glory. The second and perhaps most, I think, interesting response that you can make to Machiavelli is to say that Machiavelli underestimates the destructive, corrosive consequences for your mind, your body, and your soul if you try to be a politician of that sort. Machiavelli believes that you can somehow wear a mask to take power and then remove that mask once you find yourself in government, and that no damage is done. So you can somehow lie and you can bullshit and campaign and you take power, and then you can be a good prince. Right? This is fundamental to his assumption. But actually, I think this is not true. The things that you have to do to take power in that way undermine the qualities that you need to govern well. This is a very important theme in European politics and in American politics today. The way that you campaign is damaging to the way that you actually run the country. Why is that? Well, the way that you campaign is that you campaign in primary colors. You have 3-word slogans: take back control, get Brexit done. Everything is extremely simplified. You are incredibly optimistic. Everything's going to be great. You know, Britain's going gangbusters. We're going to sort everything out. Global Britain, terrific. Every problem has a solution. Everything is highly simplified. There is no room for complexity. There's no room for nuance. And everything is incredibly tribal and partisan. No space is given to listening to the other side or giving any credit to the other side. No. The metaphors are all about killing the opposition, destroying the opposition, burying the opposition. So that is the mask you put on to get elected. That's the mask that's demanded by modern media. That's the mask that's increasingly demanded by social media. But when you then take power and you try to take off that mask, you find that in fact that mask has been painted with a poison. And you remove the mask and your face is corroded with the acid that was on the inside of that mask. Because that way of conducting itself becomes semi-permanent. Most of our politicians, this is their lifelong vocation. If you are Liz Truss, you started at university, you've campaigned through your 20s. By the time you come into politics, you've run for an unwinnable seat. You have been pushing pamphlets through letterboxes year in, year out for years. You have lived your partisan beliefs. Doesn't matter whether you're a Labour Party member or a Conservative Party member or even a Lib Dem. You are living your partisan beliefs. You are campaigning. You're not thinking about policy. You're trying to win. And then you find yourself sitting around the cabinet table thinking about COVID. So it's worth thinking about this because we're in the middle of the COVID inquiry at the moment. And if you look carefully at the testimony being given in the COVID inquiry at the moment, what you realize is that what was required was critical thinking. And what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is the ability to be humble, the ability to embrace complexity, the ability to understand that there are no simple answers, the ability to be objective, not subjectively partisan, be open to the possibility that there may be something to be learnt from New Zealand, that we may be focusing on what's happening in Milan, that we may take on the possibility that maybe we're wrong about masks and people in Japan are right about masks. But campaigning is the entire antithesis of critical thinking. Instead of nuance and humility, hubris. Instead of complexity, simplicity. Instead of objective distance and analysis, partisan tribalism. And you can sense that increasingly in our governments. We are bad at policy. We are bad at governing. We are bad at critical thinking. We are campaigning 24/7. We're not thinking. And the final one of these three responses to Machiavelli, which would have been made by George of Trebizond or Patrizia or all these people I don't wish to talk to you about today, but let's take Aristotle or Cicero, is to say that they are fundamentally wrong. Machiavelli is fundamentally wrong about human nature. He's wrong about what it means to be a human, why we engage in politics in the first place. Aristotle says man is a political animal. What Aristotle means by that is every one of us is a political animal. Men, women, all citizens are and should be political animals. We should be engaged in politics. We should be engaged in the administration of our city-state, in running it. Why? Well, because our meaning that we get from life, our sense of what he calls eudaimonia, happiness, being well, doing well in being well, involves being able to discuss together our shared values, find through dialogue a common purpose, form a partnership in the creation of a state. It is not a solitary activity. It's not a selfish activity. It's not an activity primarily about power. It is an activity of community. It's an activity also of rhetoric. That's why Aristotle was very interested in rhetoric. In other words, it's an activity about persuasion. When we think about rhetoric today, we think about rhetoric in terms of mobilizing your base, us against them, developing the worst emotions of your base. But that isn't what Aristotle means by rhetoric. For Aristotle, rhetoric is about persuasion. It's about the idea that the skillful speaker can change minds, that there is a common humanity to which we can appeal, that there is a form of empathy that resonates between us which makes it possible for me to change your mind, and perhaps much more radically, and in a much more interesting way, you to change my mind. In other words, that the politician is not always on transmit, that the politician can be on receive as well, and that that is the nature of the partnership that underlies this notion of eudaimonia. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second, and I'm just going to, because I'm covering a lot of ground here, so I'm going to pause for a second. I'm just going to romp through that again, and then I'm going to push into geopolitics, okay? So I said that modern politics is actually defined not by Aristotle, not by Cicero, but by the figure of Machiavelli, particularly by Machiavelli's vision that in the end justifies the means. and that politics is not like normal private life, and that anyone naive enough to try to behave in the way that they behave in their private life in politics is going to lose. And that it's not necessary to be truthful or generous or merciful. In fact, you should be the opposite of all those things to prosper as a politician. And that that is the way to take fame and glory. And that the response that the Renaissance political theorists or the classical political theorists would make is to say, no, the fame and glory you get from being a politician in that way is not a fame and glory that anyone would want. It is the fame and glory of Cesar Borgia or Donald Trump. Secondly, they would say that you underestimate the extent to which behaving in that way to take power, putting on that mask to take power, corrodes or erodes your face. It undermines your ability to govern well, to rule well. Right? It's no good for your country because you're going to end up doing the wrong thing. And thirdly, you have a cracked idea of human nature. You don't understand actually that politics, virtue, human nature, human meaning, human purpose, community, dialogue, partnership are actually essential to the business of politics. Now I'm going to jump into geopolitics. And I'll bring Aristotle to bear on geopolitics. So, broadly speaking, we have gone through an experience since 1989 of 3 ages. We had an age of what I want to call the liberal global order that went from 1989 to 2004. Then we had a second age that went from 2004 to 2014 that I want to call the age of uncertainty. And then we had an age from 2014 to February of last year that I want to call the age of populism. And this is a very striking, accelerating transformation in the nature of our world. So let me tell you a little bit about the features of these ages. 5 features in each age, okay? First age, which is my age 89 to 2004. First assumption of this age is that we had sorted out, we thought, in the 90s, economics. Roughly speaking, the kind of economic system developed by Reagan and Margaret Thatcher had become the dominant norm across the world by the 1990s. Privatization, deregulation, free markets, and open global trade. And it seemed in places like Britain, when Tony Blair came in and didn't really change that economic system at all, as though it was delivering. From 1870 to 1980, every year from 1870 to 1980, UK GDP per capita grew more slowly than US GDP per capita. But from 1990 onwards, for the first time, UK GDP per capita became the fastest growing in the developed world. And productivity in the United Kingdom became the second fastest growing in the developed world. But it wasn't just a British phenomenon. Across the world, across Asia, across Latin America, across a lot of Africa, economic miracles were happening, driven by what appeared to be this new magic economic formula. The second assumption of this age was democracy. The assumption was that as we grew more prosperous, as our middle classes grew, we would necessarily become democracies. In fact, people drew lovely graphs from 1805 to 2005, which appeared to show there was a direct relationship between prosperity and democracy. The idea was that once the middle class got to a certain size, they would demand their rights, they would demand the vote, and actually, if you didn't give them the rights and the vote, your economy wouldn't do well anyway, because it would lack the freedom to be able to grow. And sure enough, in this period that I'm talking about, my first period, the number of democracies in the world doubled. Went from about 20% of the countries in the world being democracies to 40% of the countries in the world being democracies in that period. You know, most famously, of course, Central and Eastern Europe. This is the fall of the Berlin Wall, so suddenly Czech Republic becomes a democracy, but it's also the period where Latin America is becoming democracies, Africa is becoming democracies, and many, many other countries. You know, Indonesia becomes a democracy in 1998. The third assumption of this period is that connecting this economic theory and this idea of democracy is an idea of a liberal global order. The liberal global order is basically taking the US and its allies and its Western values through the United Nations to try to fix the world's problems. This was, of course, the high tide of Oslo, the two-state solution, the Palestinian peace process. This is happening in 1994. This is also the intervention in Bosnia, where 37,000 people have been killed in Sarajevo. There are checkpoints up and down. There are 150,000 people under arms. There are war criminals on the loose. The US and its allies intervene, and within 5 years, all the war criminals are in The Hague. The checkpoints have disappeared. There are only 6,000 people left under arms, and there are more Americans injured on the basketball court in Sarajevo than are injured outside the fence. It seems to be a great moment. We begin to develop a notion of the responsibility to protect the Chicago doctrine of Tony Blair. Fourth assumption of this period is that our values, our vision, our Western values, are things to be proud of and to be exported around the world. And we talk rather smugly about our constitutions, our human rights, our history, and our system. And the fifth assumption is that politics in this period is a bell jar. All the votes are where my fingers are, and there are no votes where my elbows are. So this is the period, 1989 to 2004, of Tony Blair, of Bill Clinton, of the Third Way, and a general sense that there are no real ideological differences anymore. Politics has largely been reduced to various think tanks competing on who can provide better papers based on best practice from Sweden. That's basically all you need to know about politics in the 1990s. Now, fast forward to 2004 to 2014. 2004 to 2014, something begins to change. Firstly, our economic system comes under huge threat. The 2008 financial crisis radically exposes that there is a fundamental problem with our assumptions about our economies. Turns out that the magic of the free market, the genius of the invisible hand, which was supposed to brilliantly protect us against anything, led to a catastrophic economic meltdown. And we become more aware in this period that while GDP has been growing, incomes have stagnated for many people, and that inequality has been growing. And inequality is rapidly growing, not just within our cities, not just between the rich and the poor, also between 60% of the population in Britain and 40% of the population, between the 60% who own houses and the 40% who don't, and between regions, between London and the southeast, of course, and places like the northeast, or in the United States, between places like Michigan and Mississippi, and places like Massachusetts, to complete my 3 M's. Inequality, right? Secondly, the idea of the necessary relationship between economic growth and democracy is shattered. And it's shattered, of course, by the great fact of China. Right? China becomes larger than the British economy as late as 2005. At the beginning of my period. 2004, the British economy is still larger than the Chinese economy. That's something pretty remarkable, given the Chinese economy is now 7 times larger than the British economy. So 2005 becomes larger than the British economy, 2006 larger than the German economy, 2007 larger than the Japanese economy. And in purchasing power parity terms, you could argue it became larger than the US economy a few years ago. But at no point does China become a democracy. And in fact, the number of democracies in the world, which has doubled from 1988 to 2004, now flatlines, ceases to grow. Third thing that changes, the idea of the liberal global order is shaken to its root. It's shaken to its root, of course, because of the humiliating messes in Iraq and Afghanistan, these grotesque adventures, where quite literally the US and its allies go into Afghanistan in 2001 to remove a Taliban government, remain in that country for 20 years, spend $1.5 trillion, and literally leave and hand the country back to the Taliban government again. The US and its allies spent $3.5 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is the same amount that China spent on its Belt and Road Initiative, which is all the roads, bridges, and dams and infrastructure that it built through Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and indeed parts of Europe. The fourth thing that begins to change in this period, well, we begin to lose our sense that Western values are necessarily something that we need to be promoting around the world. From the point of view of the right begins to say, well, maybe it's none of our business. We don't want having to do with these people on the other side of the world. And from the left's point of view, we begin to become much more conscious of our own sins. We become much more conscious of colonialism, of slavery, of embedded structural social injustices, of our environmental record, and we become much less confident about the idea that we have something to contribute to the rest of the world. And the fifth thing that begins to happen in this period is that my graph of public opinion begins to go from this to something that looks a little bit more like that. Right? Votes are beginning to emerge where my elbows are. They're beginning to leave the center ground. Enter my last age, the age of populism, 2014. Well, the age of populism is about reaping everything that has been sown in that period from 1989 onwards. Suddenly now, driven by the apparent failures of our economy, and in particular of globalization and the inequalities that go with it, a decreasing confidence in democracy, an increasing charisma, reputation of authoritarian regimes. China, in a more gentle sense, Singapore, the rise of Dubai, UAE, Saudi, all these countries that seem to be doing quite well without becoming democracies. Being a bit unfair to Singapore there, I don't want to bait there, but perhaps not a full democracy, it's not full liberal democracies in the way that the West would want. The liberal global order is absolutely shaken to its bits. And of course, one of the secrets of the populists is that they actually occasionally speak truth. It's a mistake to imagine populists as perpetual liars. What populists are is bullshitters. They are quite happy to speak the truth if it suits them. And indeed, Donald Trump is quite correct to point out that Iraq and Afghanistan were unmitigated disasters and that the people who defended these things were pretty idiotic. And that's one of the reasons why, actually, populists get a bit of a momentum. Meanwhile, the notion that there is any kind of Western values or virtue in our own society is really beginning to be shaken to its roots during this period, as we begin to confront the reality of Donald Trump taking over, and then the United States begins to bring itself into a whole series of very, very painful social movements that begins to feel like a civil war. And social media begins in my age of uncertainty, begins 2003-04, that's when Twitter and Facebook get off the ground. But social media begins to produce a situation of increasing polarization. The algorithms of Twitter and Facebook are literally designed to catch attention by exacerbating the extremes. Right? If I say at the end of this evening, had a fascinating time at St. Martin's in the Fields and, was very struck by the rather charming Corinthian capitals, I will get 5 likes. If I say, I suggested in my talk that Boris Johnson should be dragged off to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, right? I'll get 2,000 likes, right? Because that is what Twitter and Facebook does, right? It exacerbates polarization. And at this stage, then, the graph of public opinion ceases to be this. It actually becomes like the kind of souffle I make at home, right? It's a U shape. All the votes are where my elbows are, and there are no votes left at my hand. So 2014, Narendra Modi is elected in India. 2014, ISIS takes over Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. 2015, the Law and Justice Party takes over in Poland. 2016, the Brexit referendum. 2018, Bolsonaro takes over in Brazil. And of course, in 2016, most horrifying of all, Donald Trump becomes elected president of the United States. The age of populism, polarization, post-truth. Now, how does Aristotle get us out of this mess? And this is what I want to conclude on. So I would suggest Aristotle can get us out of the mess in the following ways. Firstly, let's take of my 5 things. Let's start with the economics. Aristotle would say about the economics that we need to begin with what he calls the idea of logos, literally the word, but he means reason, thought. If we are to rebuild a progressive center ground, get a graph back like this again, rebuild the idea of empathy, partnership, move away from ideas of civil war towards a communal partnership in trying to develop an idea of the common good, we need ideas. We need ideas. It is not good enough to try to fight the populists by being a tribute band for Tony Blair. You have to acknowledge that a lot was got wrong, that the economic and political models of the 1990s did not work for many, many, many people. And you need a very clear, very rigorous, very thoughtful, very detailed account of what your economic policy should be. That's the first thing. Second thing, what are we supposed to do about democracy? Well, here I think there is a very important point in Aristotle's idea of politics as partnership. I think the fundamental problems in our democracy have a great deal to do with the gap between Aristotle's ideal, which of course Aristotle was an aristocratic gentleman living in Athens, a tiny society, about 40,000 people. And his vision of what politics is pretty similar to a French mayor. You can go up to Pericles and you can prod him in the chest in the supermarket and say, I didn't really like that speech that you made earlier today. Whereas in our mass democracies, we have created a situation where we have 600 people sitting in a parliament just down the road who are very, very detached from citizens. Very difficult for anyone in this room to feel that they can really be a political animal, that they can really participate usefully in politics. Politics becomes a very distant professional game. So I would suggest that Aristotle's notion of man as a political animal could be used to reimagine a form of democracy which was firstly much more decentralized, really putting strong, impressive, powerful, accountable local institutions together again. Really embracing the idea that Manchester has a much better idea about how to run Manchester than London does, that Newcastle has a better idea how to run Newcastle, and that actually Cumbria probably has a better idea how to run Cumbria. Now, this could also go, I think, with more use of citizens' assemblies. I don't think they're the answer to everything, but they are a wonderful, wonderful innovation. For those of you who don't know about citizens' assemblies are the idea that you select by random sortition. You randomly select, like selecting a jury, a group of people who then sit for 3-4 days together, random collection of 300 people, sit for 3-4 days together with experts talking about various subjects and then come to a joint conclusion. It was used very powerfully in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, to deal with the abortion issue. You cannot imagine a more polarized, divisive issue than abortion in the Republic of Ireland, and yet the Citizens' Assembly moved the debate on from the question of pro-life, pro-choice to the question of terms, how many days a baby should be carried, and what time period an abortion should happen in, and totally transformed Irish politics. The same citizens' assemblies could be used for climate. They should have been used for Brexit. Third thing, the idea of the liberal global order. Now, here in thinking about the liberal global order, I think we need to take on Aristotle's fundamental insight about moderation. Now, those of you who are paying attention in school will remember that people talk about Aristotle and the golden mean. The idea is essentially that all virtues for Aristotle are an intermediate state. Right? They're not at one extreme or the other. Perhaps the most powerful example you can give is courage. Courage is not the opposite of cowardice. Courage is the intermediate state between cowardice and foolhardiness. That there is nothing brave about being reckless. Courage is about understanding context. It's about prudence. It's about risking your life on a reasonable basis, aware of the environment in which you operate. Now, how does that apply to the liberal global order? The liberal global order cannot be either the reckless imperial adventures of Iraq or Afghanistan, right, which were hubristic, which were a mad form of megalomania and paranoia, nor can they be the isolationism which people like Trump are trying to sell. Because the truth of the matter is, since 2014, as the liberal global order has collapsed, as the US and its allies have had less and less to do with the world has not become more peaceful in the way that we might idealistically have hoped. It has become less peaceful. In fact, every year since 2014, there have been more refugees, more internally displaced people, more civilians killed in conflict. There have been 7 coups in Africa in just over a year. The horrors of Ukraine, Russia are ongoing, and you can see very, very clearly in Israel and Gaza the legacy of the world's refusal to engage in that peace process since the 1990s. Fourthly, what are we supposed to do about the notion of our own legitimacy? Well, here I think we need to recover what Aristotle calls ethos. In other words, a sense of moral character. The only way, ultimately, in which we can engage as politicians, engage with other political parties, engage with the world, is through some sense of moral character or virtue. Now, there's a big footnote here, and the footnote is the footnote with which I began, which is that there is nothing more disgusting than politicians talking about morality. Nevertheless, it is vital. Our democratic system depends upon truth. You cannot put the tick or the cross in the box when you vote unless you have some idea that what the politician has told you they're going to do in their manifesto, they actually do. Or what the politician says in Parliament has some relationship to the truth. You have no way of holding them accountable. You have no way of assessing them unless there is some form of truth. Nor is there any purpose to politics unless there is some reasonable attention to ideas of justice and ideas of equality, the fundamental universal dignity of human beings, our equality which is enshrined in the democratic vote, which means everybody in this room has an equal right to vote because at that level we are metaphysically, fundamentally, in dignity, equal. And finally, what are we supposed to do about this thing? Well, here I think we need to return to Aristotle's idea of rhetoric. And we need to begin with his idea of pathos, or emotion. Begin with the idea that there needs to be, in centrist politics, not just a pathetic attempt to try to dust down some think tank study from Sweden. Right? The problem with the center ground is it sounds technocratic, it sounds arrogant, it sounds snobbish, it lectures people on statistics. It needs to rediscover its emotion. It could do with having a bit of a sense of humor. But it should be combined, Aristotle says, with ethos, the moral character that must underpin it, and logos, which is the clear thought about what this economic policy should be. And I want to begin and end in my beginning. And I'm going to do it by jumping back from Aristotle to a pre-Socratic philosopher, Heraclitus. So Heraclitus says that the way to think about the world is in terms of what he calls harmonia, which is essentially a pretentious Greek word for harmony. But when he says harmony, what he means is, he says it's the harmony of the lyre, the harp, the L-Y-R-E, not the Boris Johnson type, the L-Y-R-E, right? And the harmony of the bow. What he means is that you need to think about the productive ground of politics, not as a center ground between two extremes whose only virtue is that it's as far away as possible from the right and the left, whose only virtue is that it's a grey muddle in the middle that somehow tries to sort of sweep over the differences. No, he says, what you need to do is take the stick, connect a string to each end of it, and then bend it like a bow, at which point the center ground becomes this point, the point of the string. And the force of the string lies in its ability to harness the opposing tensions of right and left, to draw from the instincts of the left to justice, the instincts of the right to liberty, an ability to empathize, an ability to include, but to include and empathize not by denying difference, not by claiming that we're all the same, but by embracing the tension of that diversity in order to make the arrow fly. And with that, thank you very much indeed.
Now that's what I call raising the quality of public discourse. I'm going to dialogue with Rory for a few minutes now while you think about what your questions. I'm very delighted to know that George of Trebizond is in the building and will be asking the first question, I very much hope. But do think about, I'll get you to line up in a few moments and I'll explain that once we've had a bit of dialogue here, but do think about just a very succinct question. The skill about it is to get it into one sentence with a question mark at the end. So that's what your time now is about while I talk to Rory. Rory, in what ways in civil society, in what ways in our education systems, in what ways in our professions do we raise up people of the kind of character that you described when talking about ethos and that you echoed in your words about virtue?
Well, I think this is probably the central and most difficult question. So the traditional classical answer for this from Aristotle or Cicero or a Renaissance political theorist is that we do it through education, that we should be educating people to be virtuous. In other words, we would need to put the kind of moral values that we care about at the core of the way in which we educate our young. But I would argue also, although this is probably not a phrase that would appeal to Cicero, we could think about it in terms of midlife education too, reminding people occasionally in midlife about why these virtues matter. And oddly, one of the problems I think that we have is that we have our Nolan principles, in principles of British public life, accountability, integrity, etc. But at no point when I became a member of Parliament did anyone talk to me about those principles. I mean, one of the things that I was very struck by when I arrived as a member of Parliament is that there was no initiation process, there was no induction. Very unlike what happened when I was very briefly in the army. And as you can imagine, Sandhurst is one long initiation process and induction, at which essentially there is a great deal of effort made to try to teach you what it should be to be an officer. I think Sandhurst might even say an officer and a gentleman, but anyway, whatever it is, the idea is serve to lead was their great slogan of the time. But nobody in Parliament did that. We all rustled in, and from the first day we were sat down by the chief whip, who looked at us and essentially told us, give up on any idea of voting independently, follow what the party says, do what the Prime Minister says, and your loyalty will eventually be rewarded with you being made a minister. And that was it. There was no attempt even to try to evoke the history of the place, the history of the building, our predecessors, or anything of that sort. Taking over a government department, I could never get a handover. I could never hear from my predecessors. And when I suggested to my successors that they might want to know what I'd been doing in the department, they never wanted to meet me. There was no attempt to do the most basic things you do in a normal job, like 3 weeks of training to try to explain before you take over. I mean, imagine you're Matt Hancock taking over as Secretary of State for Health, right? That's quite a big job. You're responsible for quite a lot of hospitals, quite a lot of ambulances, quite a lot of patients. 10 million patient visits a year. But you're expected on day one to stand up at the dispatch box and bluff as though you know what you're talking about. So I think it's a profound question, and I think that it's a very, very difficult thing for us to answer because we are singularly failing. I mean, there was a lovely essay by Anthony Kenny, who was the head of Boris Johnson's college at Oxford, saying, where did we go wrong? What happened in our education system? How did we produce this? And I think I'm being mean to Boris Johnson. I forget him as an example. I think it's true of all of us. I think something is missing. And I think the insight that Cicero or Aristotle would have is that no number of constitutions, no number of rules are sufficient if the politician entirely lacks a sense of integrity. And maybe we can return to that word, because I think that word integrity is a really interesting word, and I think it's at the core of a lot of what we're discussing.
I was very moved by your conversation on the leading podcast with Michael Ignatieff. I felt there was a meeting of minds and souls there, and after listening to that podcast, I read your very vivid description about being a minister, much as you've just addressed a moment ago, in the Conservative government. And there's a passage towards the end of your book, Politics on the Edge, where you talk as if after, shall we say, 7-8 years in Parliament, I really thought people were in this to make social change for the better. I really thought what we were about was representing the people at their best to face the worst situations in the world. But I'm not meeting anybody who seems to think like that. And there's a kind of poignancy and a humour, which goes throughout the book, but it's a kind of two-edged humour, as much of the humour in the book is. Why did a person like you, with the brain that you have and the vision that you have, ever think that you could make your way through the murky corridors of Parliament? Is that not a job that only a Machiavellian can do?
Well, so this interview that I did with Michael Ignatieff was very interesting. I mean, Michael is much more sympathetic towards Machiavelli and Weber and Michael Walzer than I am. Not to say that Michael is lacking in integrity. Michael has an immense amount of integrity and honour. He was the leader of the Canadian Liberal Party, almost became Prime Minister. But the conclusion he's taken from his career is that he was no good at the job. He's left with immense admiration for practical politicians who roll their sleeves up, who don't intellectualize too much, and who just get on with it. And he's got huge admiration for just the sort of practical daily skills of being able to communicate and keep going. And he tends to agree with Machiavelli and Weber that you can't really apply the standards of private life to public life. That it's fine all's fair in love and war, basically, from Michael's point of view. Now, so I think if you'd like to listen to that, I mean, I think it's worth listening to, because Michael's very, very smart, and I think he makes the case against me very well. And I think the case against me, which is sort of implicit partly in the question, can be developed further. I mean, I think that there is a very strong case to be made that I'm just no good at being a politician. And not in a sort of self-serving, self-flattering, I'm too pure to be a politician. In some ways, I wasn't very good at it. I got better at it. I was a better minister by the time I was in my fourth ministerial job than I was in my first ministerial job. But it's a very, very strange profession. I mean, I had to learn that a minister, for example, is not a senior civil servant. It sounds a simple thing to say, but what I mean by that is that that's a very profound lesson. Learning that you can't run a government department through committees, that you have to reach out to the public and the media to actually take power in your own department and then use the public and the media to drive change within your own department if you want to achieve radical change. These are very difficult, strange things, which makes politics an odd profession. Now, the question of what I thought I was doing, I think relates to what I was saying at the beginning when I said why you shouldn't listen to politicians. I think I suffered from extraordinary fantasies, many of which are sort of dangerous and are mockable. I think I certainly suffered from strange ideas that I could come in sort of heroically and kind of fix Britain and fix my department and change the world and all this kind of stuff. Ideas of the world which probably I would have been better growing out of in my early 20s and not trying to persist into my late 30s, early 40s. I do think, though, there is a structural issue, which is that, of course, everyone in this room knows at some level that politics is a strange business. But we still go to school, and we still send our children to school, where their vision of politics are pictures on their wall of Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Gandhi in black and white, looking grand. And the impression given is that what we're off to do is to be Nelson Mandela. And the truth of the matter is, most of us can't be Nelson Mandela. In many ways, we're quite lucky not to be Nelson Mandela. The poor man spent an enormous amount of time in prison and inherited one of the most brutal apartheid societies imaginable, and was forced to go through this incredible act of grace because he was embedded in tragedy. Our world is not like that. And part of our disappointment with ourselves and with politicians, I think, is that we're often holding them to standards which are not realistic, which are not mature, which are not appropriate for the kind of societies we're in.
Thank you. Well, one more from me, and while I'm talking, don't feel embarrassed to find your way into the centre aisle. We just have the one microphone from which to ask questions, and we'll take 3 at a time when we get there. I have to warn you, I probably will not take everybody who stands up. I'm just telling you that now. One more from me as people, and you're welcome to come down from the galleries as well if you'd like to. We're sitting, some people are now standing, in a church. You've articulated through your career a vision of conservatism that is about cherishing tradition and about being one nation, holding communities together, and you've articulated that magnificently tonight. When Tom Holland, who also does a podcast, I believe, and does quite well, was here a month ago, he said the radical thing about Christianity that made it such a threat to the Roman Empire was that it subverted hierarchies, it upset the status quo, and was so dangerous that its proponents had to be put to death in the first 3 centuries. Could you give us a sense of how Christianity, as you understand it, can play a role in the social and political vision that you've outlined?
I mean, I think the Christian moral vision... Sorry, I'll speak up more. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Am I audible at the back, or have I suddenly ceased to be audible? As soon as somebody asks me about Christianity, I start mumbling. So look, take with a pinch of salt what I'm saying here. I feel even more embarrassed to be asked in a church to talk about Christianity than I am embarrassed as a politician to talk about morality. But I think that the Aristotelian vision of virtue is incredibly important as an underpinning of the way that we think about Christianity. But Christianity is a transformation, a miraculous transformation of that vision into a much better place. In the end, the reason why we cannot rely on Aristotle is that Aristotle is particular, not universal. Christianity is universal in the way that Aristotle's vision is really specific to Republican Athens in the 4th century BC. Secondly, Aristotle's vision in the end is elitist. It's the vision of the virtue of a prosperous man, a prosperous free man in Athens. The vision of Christianity is radically, fundamentally egalitarian. The distinctions which mattered to Aristotle between aristocrat and peasant, man and woman, freeman and slave, are dissolved within Christianity. This therefore means that Christianity's contribution to politics is much more powerful, much more exciting than the beginnings that Aristotle is getting to, because the things that I spoke about, right, if you take those 3 critiques that I made against Machiavelli, made from a Christian point of view, they are much more powerful. Firstly, when Aristotle says the type of fame and honor that you achieve through bad behavior is not worth having, the Christian notion of a valuable life is so radically different that that question hardly emerges. Secondly, when it comes to the question of the corrosive life, the way in which politics damages your mind, your body, and your soul, again, there too, the Christian message is far more radical in terms of the type of humility, the type of critical thinking that it would demand. And thirdly, when it comes to politics as a partnership, because of its radical notion of equality, Christian notions of empathy, Christian notions of listening, Christian notions of humility, Christian notions of partnership are far more radical, which is why the real answer to Machiavelli is not Aristotle, is not Cicero, but is in fact Thomas More. And if you're looking for somebody who says, "Here I stand," it's Thomas More. What More fulfills in his life? Remember, the guy is effectively the Prime Minister of England. Provided he continues buttering up Henry VIII, as Lord Chancellor, he runs the kingdom. And he chooses to do something which for Machiavelli would be incomprehensible. He chooses to say no. And by doing so, he demonstrates that the true meaning of the political life is not a question of success or failure, that politics finds its fruition the moment where you realize that you have to say no, and that the true meaning of More's life is found only in his ending.
Now, thank you so much. Now, we have just over 20 minutes for questions. I would ask you again, please, one sentence with a question mark at the end. That is out of respect for all the people behind you, because we won't have time for all the questions if the questions are longer than the answers. If the questions do get very long, I will interrupt you, just for the sake of other people to get a chance to ask a question. We're going to take 3 questions at a time. If Rory doesn't answer all 3 of them, that's again out of giving everybody a chance. It's his discretion which questions he answers in which order. Susan, take us away. Go ahead.
I can hear you. I don't know. I'll repeat.
Talk nice and loud and I can repeat the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's good.
I'm American. I live in London. And I heard from 3 different quarters today exactly the same statement that I hadn't heard over here for years. And you may have just addressed, but I don't know what to say. My mouth drops open when people say this to me. You know, the world situation, the way it is painful, is difficult. And in 3 different quarters, people said, well, why talk about it if you can't do anything about it? What?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why talk about it if you can't do anything about it?
I'll be as succinct as I possibly can. I
Go.
want to be specific. So we're in a church today. You've talked about the importance of tradition in inculcating virtue. And in your discussion of virtue, you didn't necessarily address directly where virtue comes from. Evidently, you've benefited from a classical education, and that's something which is often undermined in our progressive society. So I want to ask, here's my question, how can we really hope for a general sense of virtue in society and in public life when the forces which have traditionally inculcated virtue have been so intentionally undermined?
Thank you. Jolly's got the questions from the online
Absolutely.
audience.
We've got some people watching online. Somebody asks, Aristotle and Cicero didn't die happy. Are you optimistic?
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
Why talk about it if you can't do anything about it?
Let me take those
Okay,
3 together.
cool.
So,
Sure.
why talk about it if you can't do anything about it? What are we supposed to do in a world in which the institutions that were supposed to engender virtue have been undermined? And Aristotle and Cicero didn't die happy. Why are you optimistic? I think optimism needs to be what in Aristotle would be called euelpsis, good hope. And the difference between euelpsis, good hope, and other forms of hope is that good hope is grounded in reality. The danger that we face in our society is the wrong type of hope. A form of optimism that is so absurd, is so detached from any ground reality, that it is in fact a form of pessimism. I felt this when I was in Afghanistan. I saw it first in Afghanistan. When people said to me in Afghanistan, I remember I just walked across Afghanistan and I walked for 32 days and I'd been in villages which were often at conflict with their neighbors, and a lot of people were producing opium poppy for the international drug market. Women had often not been more than 2 hours' walk from their village in their lives. In each village, maybe one person in the village could read or write. Literacy rates were very low. And I turn up in Kabul, and on the stage is Hamid Karzai, Ashraf Ghani, and for some reason, Bianca Jagger, who was the UN ambassador. And the Afghan minister says, every Afghan is committed to a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And I realized then that I couldn't even translate it into Dari. I wouldn't know how to say that to anybody that I'd been staying with. And that is an example of optimism which has no rooting in reality, an optimism that's a form of pessimism. People who say that kind of stuff actually think they can't do anything at all. You talk like that because you basically have no interest in changing the world. What Aristotle would say is that if you root yourself enough painfully in the problems, it feels very alien to our world. Make people dwell on the problems, dwell on the nastiness, dwell on the horror. From that, you can develop the knowledge, the skills, the specificity to be able to solve those problems. And that's where good hope comes from.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask, do you think these ages you described are more defined by the prevailing ideologies and worldviews of the time, or by economic circumstances and global events?
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. For those of us who are Christians and who are therefore primarily citizens of another kingdom, whose values are not set by Aristotle or Machiavelli, but by another logos, how can
It's right.
how can we engage with politics when our split loyalty prevents us from being strictly partisan?
Thank you.
Yes, okay.
Hi, Rory. How does your vision of a decentralized, devolved form of government and politics sit against the examples of highly successful examples of centralized economies and politics like China and Singapore?
Very good.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, three questions. First question, I tend to think that it isn't to do with the personalities of the leaders. I tend to think it's more to do with fundamental substructures, the way that global trade and markets revealed their flaws in the 2008 financial crisis, the way that social media drove polarization, the way that the rise of China and its own political evolution affected the legitimacy of democracies. These are the kind of things that I think, and I could add other things to it in explaining the rise of populism. Immigration is something we didn't talk about, but it's a very, very important, very difficult word, but it's at the heart of a lot of this. I don't think it's particularly the individual. I think it's no coincidence that you end up with populists emerging in 4 continents at the same time. So I think it's more to do with fundamental substructures which are close to global. What do we say about effective central states? I think the problem with a central state is that it's fundamentally patronizing, even if it can be effective in the short term. It doesn't take into account the fact that we have never been so educated, we've never been so healthy, there has never been so much wisdom, knowledge, and experience in our populations, and that the only way of making meaningful societies is to try to get power closer back to our citizens and away from the experts in the center. As for the question on Christianity, I heard a very good sermon yesterday on the subject of the coin and rendering unto Caesar, and the clergyman made a very good case for the powerful ambiguity of Jesus' words there, questioning how much really is Caesar's. How much actually has to be rendered to Caesar. But I think that passage from the Gospels has much more to say about it than I do.
Thank you. Benjamin.
Hello. I'm glad you mentioned Afghanistan. During President Trump's presidency, there was peace in Afghanistan. The Taliban hadn't taken over Afghanistan. There was peace in Ukraine. The Hamas knew their place. China trade war was won. He had the lowest black unemployment in the history of America. Why is that not better than the mess we're looking at now?
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin.
Hi, Rory. A simple one. Do you think what you said tonight is what will make you to be a Tory again, or as Alastair has been trying to preach on you, to make you become a Labour supporter?
Thank you.
And another question from online. Louise asks, whilst considering egalitarianism, what would your thoughts be on the differences between meritocracy and elitism, especially within the context of reducing poverty and the education gap?
Okay, wow, all right. Okay, first question on Trump. I thought that was actually a really good observation. I need to think about that more. I do think that President Biden has a great deal to answer for what actually happened ultimately in Afghanistan, and I don't think, much though I dislike Donald Trump, I don't think it's fair to say that he was forced to do it by Trump's decisions. And I also think that Biden is embracing a form of isolationism which can come across as weakness, whereas Trump was embracing a form of isolationism with a kind of reckless unpredictability, which may have actually, in the short term, prevented some of those things from happening. So I think that's a good challenge. Elitism, meritocracy, the education gap. Look, there's a very, very interesting work by Michael Sandel, which some of you may have read on meritocracy. Essentially, he argues that the entire idea of meritocracy is cruel, that we think it's an uncomplicated idea, that if you work hard, play by the rules, you do well, that's fair. But of course, what Sandel points out is that if you're really serious about equality, we have many, many very different attributes, values. I mean, look, this person, okay? I think it would be a great mistake to say Rory deserves to be richer than other people because he can pontificate about Aristotle, right? I think, and what I mean by that is that if I look at myself, obviously, I'm largely conscious of luck. I'm not a great believer in meritocracy. I don't believe that, even if my brain is quite quick, even if I have quite a good memory, that doesn't really seem to be something for which I should be rewarded. Even if I work hard, I'm not sure that's something for which I should be rewarded. I don't see really why at a most fundamental level that's a very good way of organizing society. And this maybe relates back to the conservative Labour point. I think all these parties have a problematic notion of equality. I think all these parties struggle to think about the very poorest. I think I mentioned in the lecture that one of the fundamental inequalities in our society is between the 60% who own houses and the 40% who don't. It's staggering, that wealth division. I mean, staggering. Far greater than any other division. We conceal it from ourselves because we look at income, not wealth. If you look at wealth, it is staggering, that difference. But none of the political parties want to talk about the top 60% against the bottom 40% because they want to mobilize their voters. And they never want to talk about the 6 or 7% who are at the most problems in our society. Nobody's talking about prisoners. Nobody's talking about prisoners. None of these parties. And yet, in our prisons, 50% of our prisoners have mental health issues. 40% have been excluded from school compared to 2% of the general population. 35% have been brought up in care, again compared to about 2% of the general population. Who's talking about them? Who's embracing them? Who's coming up with a policy that's serious about them? And that's going to be my challenge to the smugness of all our political parties.
Thank you.
So I guess I'd say as a disaffected young person, I'd say your prescriptions about improving the state of our politics are perhaps energizing, if not kind of invigorating, right? But the audience here, I would say, and probably myself included, as someone who has your book in my bag, several of your books, and would like them signed at some point, we're probably already amongst your already converted. How and when are you going to stand up again and do something to practically enact the change that you have spent the evening here preaching about, rather than, as you've just said, pontificating about political philosophy and virtue in what is likely an echo chamber?
So you alluded to community councils and people coming together to sort out issues, Brexit being a notable one. But on that same note, why do you think compromise has become such a dirty word and seen as weakness now? And similarly, how do you deal with kind of growing apathy from all of the discord and horrible things going on in politics, especially amongst younger people like myself and younger?
Thank you.
Hello. Do you feel, you start with desire to follow Aristotle and Cicero, but do you feel yourself constantly being dragged back into the world of Machiavelli? And I'm particularly talking about your interview with Novara Media, where you had some good words to say about Jeremy Corbyn, that you sort of backtracked on, and as far as I could see, without a shred of evidence, because the world out there, the media, and the people, the powerful influences, that's what they want to hear you say. How do you feel about that?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'll take...
Okay, let me try to put three questions together there. So I think the problem of compromise, apathy amongst young people, mobilization is a very serious and real one. So the younger voting group is very unusual in historical terms. The sort of 18 to 25 group is quite unlike any group that we've ever seen before. We're now seeing figures of 40% of people in that age group saying they would support a military government or a strong government. That support for democracy in that age group is lower than we've seen historically for a very, very long time. It's also a much more polarized age group than we've seen for a very long time, highly polarized. Which again is unusual. Generally, the idea used to be that you were left-wing when you were young and you were right-wing when you were older. But in fact, this group is surprisingly caught up in its own culture wars. On the question of compromise, which partly relates to this question of Jeremy Corbyn, I found a very interesting episode that. So I said that Jeremy Corbyn should not have been thrown out of the Labour Party, which I believe. I think he shouldn't be thrown out of the Labour Party. I believe it is a constitutional point. I think it's extremely bad for party leaders to throw out members of Parliament. That may also be a personal point. Boris Johnson threw me out of the Conservative Party, so maybe I have a personal axe to grind. But I think that it's important in a parliamentary democracy that you don't end up in an elective dictatorship from the leader, and one of the ways to avoid it is to prevent them throwing out members of Parliament. And I think it's particularly bizarre to throw out the former leader of your party. At the same time, I also think that there was anti-Semitism in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. And I think it's possible for me to hold those two positions. Now, what I discovered, of course... Well, I don't wish to get into a debate now about this, otherwise we'll be here all night. But I think what I'm trying to suggest, I think perhaps links to this question of compromise. What I discovered, of course, is that I was in a very lonely position. Right? Everybody on one side wanted Jeremy Corbyn thrown out of the Labour Party, and everybody on the other side wanted me to say there was no anti-Semitism in Corbyn's Labour Party. If you try to chart a middle ground on that, or indeed on Brexit, where I found myself trying to argue for a very soft Brexit, a single market customs union Brexit, and found one side was Remain and the other side was the hardest Brexit possible. And I think this is the nature of the world. I think people are righteously polarized. They find it very difficult to find nuance, very difficult to empathize. I think it's possible to say there was anti-Semitism in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, but that it wasn't to the extent to which his detractors suggested, that he himself was not an anti-Semite, and that all these things can be said without having to get in one camp or the other. Now, as for the question on why I don't get back into the arena or stand, that's a very difficult one for me, and it's taken me a very, very long time to come to terms with it. I mean, I find myself in some ways a very privileged position, which is lots of people nicely come up to me and say, why don't you come back and stand and get involved in politics? Truth of the matter is that I feel shattered, I feel exhausted, I feel I wasn't very good at it. And to the question, I want to say, why don't you?
Very good. Okay, we've got literally 2 minutes. We've got 4 questions. It really needs to be one sentence, a question mark, and then Rory gets to say whatever he'd like to say in response to those questions.
Okay, speaking as an optimistic 60-year-old who read Plato's Republic, actually, but Machiavelli when I was younger. On your analysis in your 3 ages, what impact, if any, do you think global warming and global population have had? So if we look at 1989, global population was 5 billion. 2004, it was 6 billion. 2014, it was 7 billion. It's now 8 billion. And it's a hell of a lot hotter than it was. So that's my question.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Last week, we had Ken Loach also dip gently into politics, and he made the comment that Jeremy Corbyn would have been elected if it had not been for people, establishment people, and people in the political classes who had basically done him down, that he was someone addressing causes, not symptoms. So my question is, is that true, that anybody who wants to change the system is not able to?
Thank you.
Okay.
Two more.
Hi, Rory. So you mentioned about how faces of governments are formed during the campaigning stage of elections. Heading into an election year in both the UK and the US, how do parties combat those sort of populist campaigns with more nuance and more complexity, and bring that conversation to more realistic terms?
Thank you.
Very good.
Last question.
It's become normal to do illegal things for government. The Home Secretary has been taken to court on several occasions for acting illegally. Do you have any hope that things will change?
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, look, let me try to sort of weave only tangentially related to those questions some thoughts together. I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, on this point about population and climate change, very, very, very fundamental. And I think look, please be aware that my essay in contemporary history is necessarily very partial. And I think I produced 5 factors. I imagine this room could generate 50 very intriguing, interesting themes of which population and climate change would be very important. And I think if I'm pushing forward into the future, I want to put artificial intelligence in the center of our conversation about what's happening over the next 10 years. I do think that the rule of law is important, but I also think that it needs to be allied with what I began with, which is the idea of virtue. Curiously, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, in 2009 founded with Cherie Blair the Africa Justice Project, dedicated when she was a young lawyer to the promotion of the rule of law in Africa. And now she's Home Secretary. So what has happened that somebody who was working with Tony Blair's wife on a project like that in 2009-10 is now the woman that she is today? The answer is not really about her fundamental beliefs. The answer is Machiavelli. She is a political entrepreneur. She can spot possibility. Just as political parties around Europe are spotting possibilities in a new narrative which is savagely against immigration, skeptical of climate change, desperate to delay action on net zero, engaged in culture wars. This is a pattern book, a script which is being followed by political entrepreneurs. What is the solution to this? The solution to this has to be us somehow cumulatively, not all of us, but many of us beginning to take seriously the problems that we face in our societies and then committing ourselves to fixing them, people in this room. Whether that is engaging in local democracy, because I think local democracy is hugely important, or the way in which you use your vote, or the civil society organizations that you dedicate yourself to, or the way in which you educate the next generation, or the way in which you hold politicians and journalists and businesses accountable. Because I think there is, in the end, an immense power in us. I'm not feeling gloomy. Biden beat Donald Trump and will probably beat him again. Macron beat Le Pen. The Teal Independents won in Australia. In Poland, an enshrined populist party which had stripped everything out, put all the rules in their favor, were defeated. That's been in since 2015. It can happen. It can happen. Right? There is nothing written. And if we can sometimes do much less than we pretend, we can do much more than we fear. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. A few things to say before we close. Do come downstairs. Do buy lots of books. Rory has already signed many books. He is not able to join us downstairs, but he sends his best wishes. And he would very much like you to have a good time in the crypt, meet one another, continue the conversation. Many of you have kindly donated when you've signed up with Eventbrite to come tonight. I hope you'll see what we're doing together here as something that you want to invest in. Thank you very much to those who've been able to do so. If you haven't been able to do so, there's a chance as you leave. Or you may say, this was one of the best evenings of its kind I've ever been to. I'd like to invest in more such evenings, and you may want to swipe a card as you leave tonight. Thank you for all your contributions. Do fill in evaluation forms. I think you're all given them on the way in. Those help us shape future lecture series. And if you really want to, do come back next week, because I've heard the person who's speaking next week would very much like to see you there. That person is me. I'd love to see you next week. I want to finish by saying just this one thing. Thank you all for the quality of discourse, the questions, the participation, the engagement. Abraham Lincoln talked about something called the better angels of our nature. I think what we've experienced tonight is a person who's seen the ugliness of the interstices of politics closer than maybe anybody here has, who has not lost his hope, who has not lost his vision, who's certainly not lost his ability to inspire a huge crowd of people, who has raised the level of our own discourse, not just the country's discourse, but has raised the level of our own discourse tonight, and makes, I suspect, every single one of us leave this building feeling better about the civil society in which we engage, more empowered to engage in it, and more confident that there are people who've been at the centre of public life, who have truth to speak and have lives to admire and to imitate. Thank you, Rory Stewart. No photos.